But we're going to go ahead and move geographically here back to Iran, where we are in a war doom loop. Doom loop. I think that's the best way to describe it. I mean, we're barely halfway through the 60-day MOU period, Zoe, and the war seems to be back on for maybe the third time since the agreement was signed. In the past week alone, the U.S. has bombed more than 300 targets across Iran and announced that it's resuming its blockade of Iranian ports, revoked the oil waivers that were supposed to be one of the deal's core incentives. Iran, for its part, has declared the Strait of Hormuz closed again and has struck back at Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, and Oman, Arab countries that are hosting U.S. military assets. At the center of it all is, of course, a fight over what the MOU actually says, or means, I should say. Washington and Tehran signed the same document and walked away with two very different understandings of the agreement, specifically on who controls the Strait of Hormuz. And this agreement has not formally collapsed yet, but we're certainly getting there. Mm-hmm. Trump himself now says the MOU didn't mean much, while simultaneously claiming the U.S. will end up controlling the strait outright. To help us understand what's going on, we are joined once again by Trita Parsi, co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and one of the foremost experts on U.S.-Iran relations. You can follow his excellent analysis at his Substack, tritaparsi.substack.com. Trita, welcome back to BT Live.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Well, let's jump right into it. There are plenty of disagreements between the U.S. and Iran over this memorandum of understanding, but the trigger for this round seems to be the Strait of Hormuz, which is in paragraph 5. And like I mentioned, Washington and Tehran, they signed the same document, but they've walked away with two very different understandings of it. So can you walk us through what the MOU actually says about the strait, how each side is interpreting it, and why that disagreement, more than anything else right now, is what has brought the bombs back?
Yes, and I think, let me first start off by saying, look, sometimes you have to write these MOUs in a way that leave some ambiguity in order to just make sure that not every small disagreement stands in the way of a larger agreement. This time, it seems like it's a little bit too big. The paragraph in question, number 5, does not explicitly say that Iran controls the strait. It does say, however, that Iran is responsible for ensuring the safe passage of ships. And this is probably because at the end of the day, it was the Iranians who closed the straits, and they're the ones who mined the strait as well. Now, the Iranian interpretation as a result is that everything has to be coordinated with Iran, and there's no southern or middle or northern corridor. The whole strait is Iran's responsibility. It doesn't mean that they're going to charge anyone. In fact, they haven't stopped a single ship as long as that ship coordinated its exit or its transit with the Iranians. But this is not the interpretation of the United States and some of the GCC states, who believe that just because Iran is responsible doesn't mean that Iran has to ensure safety, doesn't mean that it's responsible, and certainly not for the entire strait. So the US has been pushing for the establishment of a southern corridor. That corridor goes through Omani waters. Part of the problem for the US was that the Omanis was not on board with that. The Omanis were the ones who put forward the idea of a joint management system between Iran and Oman. They were the ones who talked about having environmental transit fees instead of tolls. And this is probably part of the reason why Trump at one point threatened to bomb Oman, because it wasn't getting in line. But after Rubio visited, immediately after the MOU, essentially the Omanis were pushed in line. And they have, in the last round of negotiations, they put forward a proposal that essentially said, Iran is responsible for the northern corridor. It can do whatever it wants there, charge fees. Oman is responsible for the southern corridor, and Iran has nothing to do with that. The reason why the Iranians are very opposed to that interpretation is not just because, they just want to stand firm by their interpretation. It's because they're worried that the US all along has tried to create a southern corridor that the Iranians no longer can control, and as a result cannot close if war breaks out again. And since the Iranians are quite convinced that Trump was very likely to start war again, they saw these efforts, particularly when ships were trying to go through the southern corridor with their transponders off, as an effort to create a way for the Iranians to no longer be able to close the strait. And to be frank, that's probably a very valid suspicion because it totally lies in the interest of the United States to create that corridor in order to ensure that the Iranians cannot close the strait. So next time the US goes to war, it doesn't have to deal with the pesky Hormuz Strait being closed. But this disagreement, which frankly could have been resolved, had it not been that the US insisted on making sure that, I mean, if the position is that the strait should be open, there's ways that this could have been resolved. There even was a gravitation towards an agreement in which all ships would have to report both to the Iranians and to one designated GCC country. And that way, Iran is not controlling the strait, it's not solely responsible for it. And there was a gravitation towards that, but unfortunately, for other reasons, it didn't happen. So my point is that this could have been resolved. It didn't need to go in this. I think the Iranians overreacted to some of the ships by shooting at them, and ultimately Trump completely overreacted by restarting a war over this issue.
Well, in that vein, you've been very clear on multiple occasions that there is no military solution here. And in one of your latest pieces, you write, military action is unlikely to change facts on the ground in a manner that would break the deadlock. While the U.S. can degrade Iran's capacity to strike at ships in the Persian Gulf, it is unlikely to achieve that objective before the economic and political costs become prohibitive for Trump. So what is Trump's endgame here? What is Iran's? And is there still a diplomatic off-ramp, or has this last week closed that window?
So to your first question, what is the end game? I have to be very frank. I don't see any logic behind this. As I explained in that piece, which was published on Responsible Statecraft as well as on my Substack, the runway is much shorter this time around because global oil reserves are shorter, or inventories are lower than they were back in February. And back in February, the U.S. used its strategic petroleum reserve to try to stabilize the markets and buffer against these oil shocks that emerge as a result of the bottleneck in the strait. This time around, it can still do so, but it will run out of that oil much faster. And as a result, the amount of time it will take before the crisis becomes really acute is much shorter. On top of that, back then in February, it was like 9 months left to the midterms. Now it's 16 weeks, 4 months. So the political clock is also much shorter. So for any of this to work, Trump must have come up with a genius military solution that would bring out total victory one way or another within a week or two. Otherwise, I just don't see why it would be worth going down this path. Now, is there a thinking that the military action will be sufficient so when they go back to the negotiating table, the Iranian position will have softened? That may be the calculation, but I see that as a miscalculation. I think that after having started this war, the hands of those, the voices of those in Tehran who were against not the MOU, but were against signing it too soon. As you all remember, it took a long time before the Iranians signed the MOU. And they were really frustrating Trump because they were neither saying yes nor were they saying no. They were just waiting. And part of the reason I think they were waiting was because they wanted the economic pain on the United States and the global economy to rise further. But eventually the Iranians said yes, and some critics inside of their system believe that they should have waited longer. If there is a return to the talks, which would make us all very lucky if there is, I suspect that the Iranians will wait even longer this time around. Instead of saying, okay, we'll come back to the table now and circumstances are in your favor, they're going to wait, probably perhaps even after November, to give Trump as much of a defeat in the midterm elections, impose as much of a political cost on him as possible before they come back. So if the calculation was, okay, instead of just a couple of days of bombings, let's do 4 weeks of bombing and then go back to the table, I don't think it's going to work out that smoothly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It seems like Trump has once again misjudged Iran's willingness to go back to war. And as soon as there is some sort of agreement, if there is, it's like you're going to need an MOU for the MOU that specifies exactly what each thing means. But I have heard people make the argument that by signing when they did, the Iranians actually did maybe lose some leverage because now they're in this position of an unsettled settlement where the Trump administration will just like periodically start bombing again. And then they're just stuck in this situation where like none of the points that they want have been agreed to by the administration, and they just keep getting bombed. But I do want to ask you, since we lost Senator Lindsey Graham a few days ago, he was one of the most consistent voices for, mass violence and intervention really anywhere the U.S. wasn't getting its way. But he was also this crucial voice in Trump's ear in pushing for this war on Iran. I mean, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz even wrote that Lindsey Graham knew how to speak Trump's language like few others, that there's no obvious successor among Republican hawks with Lindsey Graham's charisma and access, and that his death leaves an open question about who becomes the most effective conduit for Netanyahu's messages to Trump. So I wanted to ask you, Trita, do you think Lindsey Graham's death changes at all the trajectory of this war? Are there perhaps more reasonable voices in this administration that might actually win out without Lindsey Graham being there, or is that maybe a bit too simplistic?
So look, yes, Lindsey Graham was probably the senator that was the most partial to war crimes in our era. But at the same time, the bench of warhawks in the US Senate is deep. We're still not in a situation in which the generation that objected to and protested against the Gaza genocide at US campuses have now taken their seats in Congress or in the Senate quite yet. So the bench is deep. So yes, will the loss of him be a problem for Netanyahu and those who are pushing for war? Yes. It will be a bit challenging because at the end of the day, he was very effective in building a strong rapport with Trump, while at the same time constantly pushing him in the direction that he wanted him to go. I don't think Cruz or Cotton have been at all as effective in doing so. So in some ways, his absence is going to be felt. Will it be decisive? I'm not so sure that it will be. At the end of the day, there is... Look, you're in DC as well, you can't cross the street without bumping into a war supporter or a war hawk. Very hard to find them outside of DC, but there are plenty of them in DC. So I don't see that necessarily really changing the equation that dramatically.
Yeah, unfortunately, they seem to be in abundance in that swamp. But yesterday we did see a major escalation on the Yemen front. Saudi-backed Yemeni government forces bombed the runway at the Sana'a airport to block an Iranian plane that was carrying the Ansar Allah delegation home from Khamenei's funeral. And so the Ansar Allah government blamed Riyadh directly and fired missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia's Al-Ha airport. This was their biggest strike on the kingdom in years, and they declared the de-escalation phase over. So now that we have a war that's hot and direct between the U.S. and Iran, do you also see it as metastasizing downwards into old proxy wars, Yemen and other fronts?
Look, I think it's important to recognize that what is happening in Yemen is happening in a Yemeni context. But that development is also in the larger context of what's happening in the region. It's important to remember that there's a UN Security Council resolution that imposed this blockade on the Houthis, and the Saudis want to keep that in place. In fact, it is still in place despite the Saudi-Iranian normalization. And they've been working to make sure that Yemen or the Houthis cannot rebuild logistical channels to the Iranians. The Iranians try to essentially challenge that by flying that plane to Sana'a to pick up these Houthi officials to come to the airport. The Saudis tried to stop that. It didn't work. But on their way back, they did bomb the airport as a way of making sure that this is not a new normal. This was an exception. They're not going to accept that. So I think it had its own dynamic that is disconnected to some extent from what is happening right now and much stronger connected back to some of the earlier decisions on the Yemen front. But it is taking place within this context, and as a result can spill over into a scenario in which things flare up between the Houthis and the Saudis. And even if the Iranians don't want the Red Sea to be blockaded again, the Houthis may do so out of their own interest because of their own conflict with the Saudis. So I don't necessarily see any clear coordination there, at least not yet. And I'm not even sure that this is going to escalate to that point. precisely because it's ultimately driven by Yemeni circumstances rather than it being driven from the outside.
Well, Trita, thank you so much for your analysis. We're going to have to see how things play out in the coming days and weeks as Trump tries to do the same things over and over again that keep leading him to utter failure. Trita Parsi, co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. Thank you for coming on. Yeah, thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.